listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. Our guest today is Siva Vaidyanathan, the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Anti-Social Media: How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy. Siva Vaidyanathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's very nice to be part of this.
In your book, Anti-Social Media: How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, you warn us about, quote, Facebook's direct contribution to violent ethnic and religious nationalism, the rise of authoritarian leaders, and a sort of mediated cacophony that would hinder public deliberation about important issues, thus undermining trust in institutions and experts, unquote. For those who haven't read the book, could you briefly lay out the particular mechanisms through which, as you see it, Facebook is eroding democracy in the U.S.?
There are three aspects to Facebook that we have to consider whenever we think about either the problems it contributes to or any of the potential responses or solutions. Those three aspects are Facebook's scale, Facebook's feature of algorithmic amplification, and Facebook's advertising system. So Facebook's scale, think about this. Facebook has 2.2 billion users, regular users around the world. They post things to Facebook constantly. They do so in more than 100 languages. So anytime that you ponder different methods of filtering what's flying across Facebook or monitoring what's flying around Facebook or editing what's flying around Facebook, imagine the scale it would take to deal with the scale of Facebook, right? Imagine the level of intervention that would require, whether it's human or a matter of machine learning. 2.2 billion people in more than 100 languages. Second, algorithmic amplification. The thing that makes Facebook special, one of the things that makes Facebook Facebook, is the fact that it chooses for you what Facebook thinks you consider important or interesting. Relevant is the term of art in the world. And the other term of art that's important here is engagement. So items that either generate strong lots of engagement, massive evidence of engagement, or just as importantly, items that are posted that are likely to generate a lot of engagement because they are like posts that have previously generated a lot of engagement. Those things fly around Facebook. So what accomplishes that? What are the aspects of an item that is likely to generate engagement? Well, anything that's funny, anything that's cute, but also anything that's really scary or anything that generates a tremendous amount of negative emotion. So anything that generates emotion is going to fly around Facebook, but think of the range of human emotions and think about the fact that the more extreme the emotion, the more powerful the reaction will be, the more we will react to it on Facebook, the more we will engage with the item. Engagement is a fancy way of saying all those clicks, all those shares, all those likes, and all those comments. Those are examples of engagement. So if I were to post a conspiracy theory about a major politician in America running a child sex ring in the basement of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C., and I were to post that on my Facebook page, or I were to post something like a theory about how vaccines cause autism, right? Crackpot stuff like that, totally fabricated stuff, nonsense stuff. If I were to post that stuff, I would get hundreds of comments, almost all of them negative, right? Almost all of them would tell me, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm spreading dangerous nonsense. Here are some links to facts about the matter, right? All of that good stuff, because that's how intelligent, aware human beings are taught to behave when they encounter nonsense, right? I would expect you or any of the listeners here who came across my Facebook post to post below my Facebook post that I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm causing trouble in the world. Every one of those comments, every one of those examples of engagement makes my wacky post go farther. You cannot argue with the crazy on Facebook. That is perverse, right? That's the exact opposite of what we think we should be doing. We think by confronting nonsense, we are quashing nonsense. We are pushing back on nonsense. The opposite happens. I mean, Facebook is through the looking glass. The more you engage with something on Facebook, the farther it will travel. And the crazier the thing is, the farther it will travel. So, along the way, maybe thousands of new people see my Facebook post who wouldn't have otherwise seen it. Maybe people are sharing it on their own pages saying, look at this whack job and what he said. He's supposed to be a professor. What the heck does he know, right? Every time that you do that, you share something to criticize it. It just makes it go farther. And at some point, somebody will see it and that person will go, that's interesting. That person has a point about vaccines, or that person has a point about the pizza parlor. And then that's how the danger spreads, right? So that's algorithmic amplification. We give signals to Facebook. Facebook's algorithms sense those signals, predict those signals, and amplify the crazy stuff, the destructive stuff, the hateful stuff, as well as puppies and babies and nice stuff too, right? Jokes. Now, the third party is the advertising system, the most powerful, effective, and efficient, cost-effective advertising system ever created, right? Advertising for more than 200 years has been a leap of faith. You spend a bunch of money on buying a page in a magazine or a quarter page of a newspaper or 30 seconds on television, and you hope that the people who come across it are the exact same people who might want your product or your service or your political candidate. And you kind of guess, right? If you're selling running shoes and you buy an ad in Runner's World, that's a good bet. If you're selling running shoes and you buy an ad in Time magazine, that might not be a good bet, right? Maybe you're only hitting 20% of the readers of Time, right? So, this has been the guesswork of advertising. But Facebook and Google before it invented a way for advertising to cost nothing if it doesn't hit the interested parties. If you own a business, let's say you're selling running shoes and you buy an ad on Facebook or Google, they have a system that lets you target exactly the sort of person who's likely to be interested in your ad and won't even charge you if no one clicks on that ad. So it's risk-free. It's also, you're likely to only hit the interested people, right? So imagine if you're pushing a political movement or a political candidate, the same thing. You can segregate the audience by race, by gender, by political affiliation, political temperament, by interest in particular issues, guns, abortion, whatever it is, right? And you can divide up the electorate in such a fine way that you can send very different messages to very different parts of the electorate. You could be running for Congress or city council and have completely different messages for the men in your district and the women in your district. They could even be contradictory and no one would know because the men would only see the ad for men and the women would only see the ad for women. There would be no oversight, no response, right? But in addition to that, this ad system is so powerful that it's drawing all the money away from the other institutions in our society that need ad money to fund journalism, right? So journalism is desperately trying to get noticed on Facebook because that's where all the eyeballs are. And they're pandering to Facebook's algorithms, trying to generate the most engagement. At the same time, Facebook's taken all the advertising that used to be theirs. So they're starving the very beast. They are feeding the very beast that is starving them. And that's terrible for democracy. It's terrible for democracy around the world. So you can see how all three of these dynamics, the things that make Facebook Facebook, are detrimental to democracy. And the very experience of Facebook is the other thing, just the notion that we watch this parade, this flow of images and expressions cascading down our news feeds every day. Everything's out of context. Everything is fractured. Everything is trying to grab your attention. You're always wondering what you're missing, what the next thing in the feed is. This disrupts thought in a really profound way. It undermines our ability to think about our world. It means that we're less likely to actually click through to the serious things. Because you remember that algorithmic amplification. If I were to post a really serious article, one steeped in research, well-balanced, calmly written, deliberative, that stuff sinks like a stone on Facebook. Nobody cares about that stuff. It just doesn't generate strong emotions, even if it generates some thought. But chances are no one's ever going to click through. So the fact that we've moved our politics to Facebook, that we've moved we've used Facebook to learn about the world, discover the world, it's just a terrible idea. I mean, we could not have picked a worse medium through which to exercise our habits of democratic citizenship.
Is the problem of Facebook simply the problem of communications technology plus capitalism? So in other words, will the imperatives of profitability inevitably push any successful platform towards the type of micro-demographic targeting and emotional manipulation that you're being critical of? And if not, what would an alternative profit model look like?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word simply for anything involving capitalism or media, or technology. But look, I would say that we can't wish away a world in which massive amounts of human enterprise and creativity are devoted to making money for people. That's simply a fact of life. And it's the world we live in, and it's not a world that's likely to offer us many alternatives in the future. Plenty of enriching, beneficial things operating on the profit model as well. They just never had the potential, right? The addition that we've seen in the past 20 years has been this ability to do tremendous data mining, data analysis, data marketing on readers, on consumers, on voters. And that capability is really what shifted everything. It's opened up a lot of opportunities for businesses to exploit us. But we have just as willingly outsourced decision-making to companies like Google and Facebook, right? We outsource the decisions we make, like whether to turn left or right at a street, to Google. We have outsourced decisions about which friends and relations to be in contact with to Facebook. Facebook decides which of our friends will be most important to us. We don't, right? So it's a really complicated dynamic among certain institutions that are operating on a principle of generating revenue, and in different ways, right? Other institutions that are devoted to performing bureaucratic or public services in our lives, like the state, and our own needs and desires, mostly short term, that have led us to gravitate every holiday season to buy weird obelisks that sit on our counters and listen to every word we say and then speak back to us. I mean, it's bizarre how much we just consistently opt for convenience as if this is some great value in our lives. And we've steadily and slowly opted for convenience without considering the larger cost in terms of all these other values like justice and openness and our ability to actually think.
So what for you would be the ideal communications technology in terms of advancing deliberative democracy if the economic context was no question?
Oh, yeah, the public library. I mean, we've had them for a couple hundred years. Public libraries are ideal forums for sifting through and ranking the quality of certain pieces of information. They are
but you
publicly
can't debate
minded.
at a public library.
Well, you can actually, and a lot of community centers are hooked up to public libraries. Public libraries are deliberative spaces. They hold public forums. They, and increasingly do as we've closed down other institutions that used to host those sorts of activities. Public library is just one example, but it's one of a number of examples, right? I think public universities and public schools and public forums, Chautauquas, public media, right? Public broadcasting. I think we should expand our public broadcasting footprint in the United States just because we seem to be starving our commercial broadcasting and especially our commercial journalism so badly. It seems like an imperative that we refund the practices of journalism with public money in a publicly minded way along the lines of perhaps the BBC, right? Those are things I think are necessary. In fact, when people ask me, what do we do about Facebook? I try to emphasize that there are no quick fixes to this, right? This is a massively profitable company. It's not going away. There's no easy regulation that can take care of the panoply of problems that it offers in the world. But one thing we can do is crowd it out with the good stuff, right? Really invest in our institutions that can help us think. And again, like you said, the public library is not everything. It does many things. The university is not everything, but it does many things. And for the past 40 years, we have been divesting from these public institutions that do help us think, that do help us deliberate. Again, opting for the quick fix, right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen some rich guy say, why do we need libraries anymore when we have Google? And if that rich guy would go in a public library, especially in a major American city, he would see that at 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock every day, every desk is filled with children doing their homework because it's the only quiet space in their lives and the only place they can get help with exploring the world. I mean, that sort of institution is something we have taken for granted for too long.
I'm interested in the question of thinking about social media generationally. Mm-hmm. So Facebook's only existed for a little over a decade. Mm-hmm. Do you know of any research on the way that different generations engage with the platform differently? I often wonder, for instance, if those who grew up in the more decentralized information landscape that we now have because of the internet have, say, learned to adapt by becoming more discerning or more critical of the information they're engaging with than perhaps their parents were, or is that not the case?
Right.
Have you seen anything about this?
Yeah, so I'm not sure you realize what sort of quicksand you jumped into with me on this. I actually don't believe that there is such a thing as a generation. I think it's marketing nonsense. There's no empirical justification for that.
Well, there are people who have been socialized with certain technologies and people who haven't from their childhood onwards, right?
Yeah, but there's not a break, right? There's not a point at which that one part of the human species becomes different, right? In addition, whenever we talk about generations, we're being incredibly ethnocentric because there's no way that any generalization about a generation that applies to middle-class white people in North America applies to Latino residents of the Rio Grande Valley, or applies to people in Kenya, right? I mean, just none of that makes sense. But that's we could do a whole podcast episode on how generations don't actually exist. But I will direct my response to the serious question that you raise, which is about the ways different media forms help structure our perception. I'm not sure that being born or even aware of earlier media forms makes that much of a difference in someone's outlook on life or perception of reality. I would say that one could say that there have been different moments of experience that I at 52 have had that contrast deeply with my daughter who's 13. And that's only because I was born then and she was born now, right? But it doesn't mean we're of different generations outside of the family sense of generation, like small g generation. Now, but here's the thing. There was a short period of time, I'd say between about 2002 and 2009, when I think we were operating with the potential of the World Wide Web really enhancing our ability to communicate and understand the world. It was a really short period of time. And that was the period of time before Facebook and then after that Twitter got big and sort of took over the mediation of our digital worlds, right? Took over and algorithmically structured our media worlds, right? So I would argue that since 2009, in fact, our media worlds have become more concentrated, not more distributed. But there was a great period of time in there. I actually idealize it a little bit too much, when WordPress was the technology of the moment, right? Where Blogger was the platform of the moment, where for almost no cost one could launch a pretty dynamic, interesting, well-designed site and express oneself and generate a following and create something social like a blog roll, right? Links to other blogs that are interesting. This created a lattice of links and references, and there were debates and dialogues among different blogs. That was a really nice moment. Out of that moment, we saw some, big winners, right, emerge. Talking Points Memo and a few other blogs really emerge and still exist as news sites. But Facebook and Twitter basically killed the blogosphere. And now it's mostly a memory, right? People still launch some blogs, but it really is only for the purpose of generating content to put up on Twitter and Facebook. Now, the other thing about this question that you asked, and I think is important to think about, is the role of Instagram in our social media diet, right? Instagram is owned by Facebook. Instagram is a lot less toxic in its experience. It's actually a lot more pleasurable in its experience. it's in many ways more ad heavy, but for the most part, right? When you spend time with Instagram, you're encountering the babies and the puppies and the people smiling on vacation, and the selfies and the celebrity stuff, which is stuff. It's the frosting on the cake of life. It's the stuff that makes life good, and you rarely, but not never, encounter hate speech or harassment through Instagram. And that's largely because of the way it's structured and controlled and the extent to which its algorithmic power is limited by design. That may not be true for long. Now, young people in North America, and only in North America, have been deferring their Facebook usage and instead spending more and more time on Instagram. And that doesn't worry people at Facebook because they own Instagram and they make the same money either way. They also have plans to merge those services pretty clearly. So I don't think Instagram as a standalone service is that long for this world. But it's also important to remember that Facebook is encountering constant growth, especially among young people, in those places in the world where there are more young people. Places like Brazil, places like South Africa, places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia. These are places with rapid Facebook growth and pretty much only Facebook and WhatsApp growth. That's the pairing that we see in those places, right? And what we see in those places is that everybody needs and wants to be involved in both Facebook and WhatsApp. And they do so at an early age. And they do so largely because it is, in many places, like Cambodia, like the Philippines, like Myanmar, like Sri Lanka, the only way to get connected to anybody at an affordable price. There is no other decent communication system, and there is no effective mass media system to help them learn about the world. So Facebook is everything in much of the world, right? So much of what we talk about when we talk about Facebook is unfortunately grounded in the North American experience, which I think is atypical and increasingly less important to Facebook. The real action is in those places in the world where Facebook is everything. Mm-hmm. Boy, I meandered all over and
I
totally
did have
a
a question that was explicitly about the Facebook v Instagram and Snapchat divide because
Great.
I'm and it's also generational, notwithstanding your rejection of the concept of generations. I'm in my 30s. Everyone in my peer group uses Facebook, so I use Facebook. Mm-hmm. But the undergraduates that I have taught, the 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, as you mentioned, they say that Facebook and Twitter are for old people, right, and they use Snapchat, Instagram, and they might have a Facebook profile for professional reasons, right, but they don't use it to talk to their friends.
Sure. And
statistics bear that out, as you mentioned. So the question is more. It's about the effects of a text-friendly medium like Facebook that allows you to share news, articles, links, write diatribes, debate, discuss, troll, whereas these image and video-centric platforms like Instagram and Snapchat, they don't actually allow you to engage in this debate. And so what kind of effect is that going to have? Are we going to miss Facebook?
Okay, great question. So two things to think about. One, young people have a tendency to become old people. And there are points in one's life when Facebook does facilitate social connections, especially when one's social group extends farther out into the world. People move places and also extends to other age groups. At some point, a young person is going to want to be in contact with a friend from high school who has a kid who is about to graduate high school. And Facebook facilitates that kind of connection and that sort of news of those third and fourth degree relationships really effectively. So there's ultimately going to be reason to be on Facebook, whether it's enough or enough, like the same kind of depth of immersion that you and I experience, and I'm quite a bit older than you, is up for debate. But as I said, I think in 5 years, Facebook and Instagram will be very similar. Whether the immersion in video and let's call it image-based social media services is a good or bad thing, I think it's kind of a wash for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think that our text-based interactions on Facebook are healthy. I think the way that Facebook's designed, the sort of nested comments, ultimately undermines the ability to engage in a truly deliberative way. It's great for sniping. It's great for cutting down people. It's great for my favorite thing is like launching a series of GIFs in people's comments feed, and that's not really textual. But some people do write long essays, both in their posts and in their comments, and within discrete communities that can facilitate some sort of dialogue. It's just not easy, and it's not really designed for that. Facebook is actually designed for the visual. We just force upon it the text out of habit. As you said, Instagram is not designed at all for that. It's just a kind of text intolerant. The visual is not a good way to understand the world. It's certainly not a good way to understand Brexit. It's not a good way to understand the current political crisis in Brazil. It's not a good way to understand the challenges of accepting refugees in the United States, right? Anything complex in the world, images and even video are they sort of work against that purpose. And for all those reasons, that's why text is so important to us. And that's important to remember. But what gratifies me about Snapchat, especially, and Instagram to a lesser degree, is that most people don't even pretend to use those services to learn about the world. Now, NBC News has had a fairly successful Snapchat feed for a number of years. They seem to be the only major news service that really digs Snapchat. They're not making any money off of it. It's just that they took the beach early and they haven't given it up. But no news organizations yet have found an effective way to use Instagram and maintain an audience, with the exception of TMZ. TMZ is great at Instagram, right? So, but that's because it's a kind of image-based thing, right? They want the celebrity shots, people getting out of limos and whatnot, right? So, but again, TMZ is not how one understands the world, I hope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think what your question really gets us to is, what do we need? Well, what we need is a platform or multiple platforms that actually would allow us to think deeply and deliberately, that would be designed in a way that would encourage, if not respectful dialogue, then at least frank dialogue that doesn't promote the more extreme, algorithmically promote the more extreme. And again, I think we had that in the blogosphere, which was not driven by algorithms, with the exception of Google's own search algorithms, which weren't at that time really focused on extremism as much as matching up terms.
So if you could make some quick fixes to Facebook as it currently is to make it better, what would you do?
Yeah, break it up. I don't actually think there's much you can do to Facebook. Look, those three aspects I told you about: scale, the algorithmic amplification, and the advertising system. They are the core functions of Facebook. They're what make Facebook Facebook. There is nothing you can do to fix Facebook that is not just cosmetic unless they address one or more of those items. And if you address one or more of those items, you don't have Facebook anymore. You might as well shut the thing down.
Well, back in the day, we used to have the things that we saw on our news feed weren't arranged for us by an algorithm. Right. We had less, maybe we had fewer friends back then.
Right.
Maybe we had 100 friends. Now we have 1,000 friends. And so we would see everything that all of our friends posted kind of chronologically.
Yeah. Now you actually have the option to turn that on your news feed. Nobody does, because nobody thinks to do it. Facebook doesn't say, by the way, when you set it up, right, or every couple of weeks, it doesn't remind you, by the way, you can switch it to a pure chronological feed. But even the chronological feed is somewhat algorithmically driven, because the fire hose is just too strong, right? If you do have thousands of friends, that's just a whole lot of content coming through. And what goes in your feed first is something that Facebook has to decide ultimately. It's just lighter. It's governed in a lighter way. But so look, when Facebook was tiny, right? I mean, I was on Facebook when only major universities had access to it. You had to have a .edu email address to get into Facebook, and it was, I was a professor at NYU when I got on it, and there were maybe 10 campuses that were allowed to register at the time. And back then it was fairly intimate in that sense, right? You knew the community you were dealing with. You didn't need capital F friends, friends trademark. It was small f friends. And it wasn't as visual, right? It was, in fact, very difficult to upload photos in the early days. It wasn't algorithmically driven. It didn't have a news feed. In fact, you had to go to someone's page to see what that person was about, right? All that friction was better, right? But look, there's no incentive for Facebook to reverse course, right? Facebook didn't make any money in those days, right? Facebook makes a tremendous amount of money now.
Are we doomed to Facebook?
I kind of think so, right? Mm-hmm. Here's how we're not doomed. Here's the only way out. I do think there are two necessary but insufficient interventions. One is we, in this country and in several other large countries, should adopt data protection rights like Europeans have. That would help. It would help at least limit Facebook's future endeavors. They would have to think 2 or 3 more times before they launch some new program, like totally personalize virtual reality, which they are totally doing with their Oculus Rift product, right? It would be great if we were allowed to opt in rather than just having our data sucked into our virtual reality platforms, which is going to create all kinds of nonsense. But then the second thing is, I actually think we should be able to use antitrust in a much more effective way than we have in this country for many years, and break off Instagram and WhatsApp and Oculus Rift and make those competing companies. Facebook never should have been allowed to buy those companies. Imagine if Instagram, which has about 1.2 billion users in the world, and WhatsApp, which has 1.5 billion users in the world, actually competed with Facebook's 2.2 billion users instead of basically sharing them, right? If more time spent on Instagram actually made Facebook worry, Facebook might have market pressures to change its behavior a little bit. It really doesn't. There's no competition for it. There's no regulatory threat that makes them lose sleep. They have regulatory threat that makes them hire weird political consultants and lobbyists, but that's not the same thing. They're just acting like a normal company now. And there's no technological threat, right? They're like way ahead of the curve on things like virtual reality and artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is the source of most of the investment right now in new technology. So I just don't see any real threat. We're pretty much stuck with Facebook. We need to learn to live better with it. We need to learn to enhance the institutions that do help us live better, richer lives despite Facebook.
Thank you for being with us on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Professor.
That's good. Cool.
Thanks, Ray.
Thanks.